Imagine this. You're walking up the stairs of a grand museum, and you enter through the looming front door, and you step into the exhibits. You're surrounded by objects. As we know, museums deal in the keeping of stuff. Maybe art, artifacts, material culture. Now we know that objects enter a museum collection. It fits with the name, museums collect. But have you ever wondered if it's possible for anything to leave a museum collection? It seems counterintuitive, I know. Fundamentally, museums tend to keep. They gain their value from their material holdings. So why would an object ever need to leave the museum? Well, imagine that the object was stolen or coerced from its owners. Or perhaps it's a funerary object or a precious family heirloom. Then we begin to ask, is it right for the museum to keep this? This is where repatriation enters the conversation. Repatriation can be defined as the process whereby human remains and certain types of cultural items are returned to their culture of origin. These items were often stolen, looted, or coerced from indigenous groups. Or in other cases, the items are sensitive, private cultural materials which have functions and rules for handling, rules that non-indigenous people do not know and do not live. Considering these circumstances, there is now a movement to attempt to repatriate items to living members of indigenous communities, and to reestablish better ways of being in relation with the indigenous groups that many museum collections represent. This movement is due to the continued on-the-ground activism of indigenous individuals that are trying to claim their own culture.
The leader in the legal battle for repatriation and burial rights of indigenous remains is Suzanne Harjo, Cheyenne and Hidalgo Muskogee member. Harjo's work with repatriation began when she visited the Museum of the American Indian in New York City. She and her mother were there in July 1965 and saw what her mother believed were the clothes she helped make and bury her grandfather in. Her mother was horrified, rightly so, and asked Harjo to see if the museum would rebury them. This would inspire Harjo, who is an indigenous activist and curator, to launch a national project of repatriation and reburial legislation. Harjo was joined by the National Congress of American Indians and Cheyenne, Lakota, and Arapaho religious leaders at a meeting in June of 1967 at Bear Butte, South Dakota. This national coalition would then work for museum reform and repatriation laws. Harjo and all of her partners in action decided to start at the top and work down. They used legal action to create a new Museum of the American Indian within the Smithsonian in 1989. The National Museum of American Indian Act was passed, and the North American Graves Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, in 1990. The outcome of NAGPRA is a federal law that provides for the repatriation and disposition of certain Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. NAGPRA requires federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funds, museums, universities, state agencies, and local governments, to repatriate or transfer Native American remains and cultural items to the appropriate parties by consulting with lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations.
So now that we have a little context, you might be asking, how do we actually do repatriation? Well, the entire movement, again, can be attributed to the dogged and continued activism and research by indigenous community members. Only in recent decades have the museums themselves attempted to even begin initiating repatriation. But this is all very hard to imagine, so let's take a moment to appreciate some concrete examples of indigenous repatriation claims in the museum and their various outcomes. So let's fast forward a bit. Chief Duan Halo Hornbear visited the Wellkulturen Museum in Frankfurt, Germany in 2019 and submitted a request for the return of a leather shirt that belonged to Chief Daniel Halo Hornbear of the Teton Lakota. Chief Duan Halo Hornbear is Chief Daniel Halo Hornbear's great-grandson and had photographs of his great-grandfather and a great leader wearing the shirt. The museum had acquired the shirt in 1908 via exchange with the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Prior to that, it was taken in as part of a large private collection of a New York millionaire, James Graham Phelps Stokes. How he acquired it could not be reconstructed. But the question becomes, why did this heirloom object that belonged to a great leader end up being shuffled straight into a museum rather than trying to locate its origins? The chief's shirt is a culturally specific, identity-forming object of great religious significance to the Teton Lakota indigenous community. The special patterns of glass beads and human hair, which are attributable to the Halo Hornbear family, prove ancestry. Although specific illegitimacy of the acquisition was not ascertained, the Wellkulturen Museum is a fantastic example of repatriating for moral and ethical reasons at the behest of the indigenous community. For the Halo Hornbear family, the return of the shirt is like the return of the great-grandfather himself. So as amazing as this progress with repatriation has been, there are still institutions dragging their feet. For example, UC Berkeley still has more than 8,000 individuals' remains, along with hundreds of thousands of burial objects held in their Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. These sacred objects and indigenous ancestors were studied by the university for decades without permission. Only 19% of this collection has been repatriated. So why are these remains and items still there? Because of a lack of federal recognition of surviving ancestors. This allows for items to be classified as culturally unidentifiable. All of the tribes in the area of the Ohlone group are not federally recognized, and many of these items are from that group. Therefore, they can be called unidentifiable and then denied NAGPRA claims. So, as amazing as the progress has been since NAGPRA set a federal and also an international precedent, there are still institutions dragging their feet. For example, as recently as 2020, UC Berkeley still has more than 8,000 individuals, along with hundreds of thousands of burial objects held in the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. These sacred objects and indigenous ancestors were studied by the university for decades without permission. Only 19% of their collection has been repatriated. So why are these remains and items still there? Because of a lack of federal recognition of the surviving ancestors. This allows for items to be classified as culturally unidentifiable. All of the tribes of the Ohlone group are not federally recognized in the area, and many of the items are from that group, and therefore they can be called unidentifiable and denied NAGPRA claims. So what now? Well, museums globally, whether they have federal legislation or not, should recognize the legitimacy of indigenous groups and their surviving ancestors. In the US, NAGPRA should be considered a helpful starting point, but not a loophole for limiting repatriative efforts. Beyond a legal obligation, there is a moral and ethical obligation to repatriate. It also benefits museum systems in that a relationship of mutual knowledge sharing is accessed, whereby they may discover unknown information about other items in their collections through being in good relation with indigenous authorities on such pieces. Provenance research is also a key part of ethical collections care. Trying to correctly identify what an object is and how it came to be in the collection can tell museums whether it's something that should stay in the collection. Public support of indigenous efforts to receive federal recognition will allow them to leverage NAGPRA as a legal power source. Also, supporting the right to cultural renewal practices that stimulate and create new forms of contemporary cultural practices based on recovered traditional values. Consider, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cut it out, time out, reset, okay. So what now? Well, museums globally, whether they have federal legislation or not, should recognize the legitimate, wow, I just can't do this one. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. So what now? Well, museums globally, whether they have federal legislation or not, should recognize the legitimacy of indigenous groups and their surviving ancestors. In the US, NAGPRA should be considered a helpful starting point, but never a loophole for limiting repatriative efforts. Beyond a legal obligation, there is a moral and ethical obligation to repatriate. It can also benefit museum systems in that a relationship of mutual knowledge sharing is accessed, whereby they may discover unknown information about other items in their collections through being in better relation with indigenous authorities on such pieces. Provenance research is also a key part of ethical collections care. Trying to correctly identify what an object is and how it came to be in a collection can tell museums whether it's something that should stay in the collection. Public support of indigenous efforts to receive US federal recognition will allow them to better leverage NAGPRA as a legal power source. Also, supporting the indigenous right to cultural renewal practices that stimulate and create new forms of contemporary cultural art based on recovered traditional values should be considered as part of an ongoing support of contemporary art rather than a loss of historical art. Supporting and funding exhibitions that explain repatriation of items and making them a more front-facing process that moves beyond collections management. This can include new viewing places that the works will be returned to, often cultural and heritage centers, which also informs people of where they can see these things while supporting the community of origin through patronage of their educational institutions. Repatriation can be understood as an activist movement with transnational involvement. The tireless efforts of Indigenous people globally have resulted in institutional change. Museums should now know that there is an ethical responsibility to return stolen and sensitive cultural patrimony to its rightful owners. The best stewards of material history are the people that created it. So I hope that the next time you enter a museum, you remember to ask yourself, how did all of this get here? And maybe ask, should it be allowed to leave? Thank you.